The Leader of Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, this is about trust, and my question is for the Premier. The people of Ontario put their trust in this government and in this Premier. The Premier put her trust in Pat Sabera, her former Deputy Chief of Staff. This staffer breaks the trust by allegedly bribing Andrew Olivier, promising him a government job in exchange for a political favour that benefited the Ontario Liberal Party. Instead of distancing herself from the accused, the Premier rewards her, entrusting Pat Sabera with leading her next campaign. Mr. Speaker, why does the Premier continue to place her trust in Pat Sabera? Is it because Pat Sabera does exactly what the Premier asked?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. You know, there has been an investigation, and I know the Leader of the Opposition knows that. At every stage of the investigation, we've cooperated fully, and we will continue to do so. I said in 2015, if any charges were laid as a result of the investigation, then Patricia Sabera would step aside, and this will happen if charges are laid, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Premier. Media are reporting that Pat Sabera, the CEO of the Ontario Liberal Party, will be charged with bribery from her time as the Premier's Deputy Chief of Staff. She is accused of bribing Andrew Olivier to step aside as a contestant in the Sudbury by-election. Mr. Speaker, did the Premier order the current CEO of the Ontario Liberal Party to allegedly bribe Andrew Olivier during the Sudbury by-election, yes or no?
I am going to be listening very intently to the questions and the answers. I'm going to say two things. First of all, it's very difficult for me to ask a side to keep quiet if I'm getting responses while the question's being put. I'm asking that we treat this with a sensitivity. I am going to listen carefully. If I get a sense that the member is making an accusation of abetting that is not appropriate, and I will say so. It's dangerously close to that now. I will allow the question to be put, but I'm listening carefully to ensure that that does not happen. Premier.
Much, Mr. Speaker. Well, I will say again, in 2015, I said that if any charges were laid as a result of the investigation, then Patricia Sabera would step aside. If charges are laid, Mr. Speaker, that will happen. And I believe, Mr. Speaker, it to be true that if charges are laid, we all have a collective responsibility to let the matter be handled by a court of law under the presumption of innocence. That's the reality that we're confronting, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Final supplement.
Mr. Speaker, back to the Premier. I'm not getting an answer to this question. Pat Sabera, now the CEO of the Ontario Liberal Party, told Andrew Olivier, quote, "You've been directly asked by the Leader and the Premier to make a decision to step aside," end quote. Pat Sabera told him, quote, "You're the third person I've ever heard the Premier ask this of," end quote. Pat Sabera has now been charged, according to the media, with bribery. So, Mr. Speaker, who ordered the CEO of the Ontario Liberal Party, Pat Sabera, to allegedly offer Andrew Olivier a bribe? I would appreciate an answer to a very straightforward question.
Mr. Speaker, there has been an investigation that has occurred outside of this House, as it should, Mr. Speaker. Yep. If there are charges laid, this matter will be handled in a court of law, Mr. Speaker. It's our responsibility to, under the presumption of innocence, Mr. Speaker, to allow that matter to be dealt with in a court of law. I said in 2015 that if charges were laid, then Patricia Sabera would step aside. If charges are laid, that will happen, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you.
Yeah.
New question. Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Premier. The Premier has said she, and I quote, "had a conversation with Andrew Olivier," end quote, and that the Premier's closest political confidant, Pat Sabera, had a conversation the next day. This isn't about Pat Sabera stepping aside if charged. That should be a given. My question, and I'll be very clear, crystal clear again, Mr. Speaker, who ordered Pat Sabera to allegedly offer Andrew Olivier a bribe? The House deserves an answer.
Government House Leader.
House Leader.
Thank you very much, Mr. Premier. The Premier has been open with the legislature, the media and the public about the allegations related to the Sudbury by-election. As the Premier said, and she's absolutely right, Speaker, if the charges are laid, it will become our shared responsibility to allow those charges to be dealt with in the court of law, not in this House. Speaker, we will continue to cooperate with the independent investigation. I also want to confirm, Speaker, that if any charges are laid, the matter will be handled by the Public Prosecution Service of Canada. Thank you.
Supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, back to the Premier, and let me say it speaks volumes that the Premier refuses to answer these very direct questions. Pat Sabera said to Andrew Olivier that, quote, "It's not a question of whether we know you want it. The Premier is asking you to agree to put that aside for now," end quote. Media are reporting that Pat Sabera will be charged with bribery as she tried to get Andrew Olivier to give up his democratic right to run for office. Mr. Speaker, again to the Premier, who
Start the clock. Please finish.
Mr. Speaker, directly to the Premier, who ordered Pat Sabera to allegedly offer Andrew Olivier a bribe? And if the Premier refuses to answer, that says everything, Mr. Speaker.
Speaker, I think it's very clear, and Ontarians totally understand that if there are any matters that are dealing with the court, it has to be dealt.
I'm trying to get a message to you that I want quiet.
All legal matters must be dealt in the court of law. This legislature is not such place. If any charges are laid, they will be dealt with in the courts by appropriate independent authorities. As I mentioned before, Speaker, and I'll restate that if charges are laid, the prosecution will be conducted by the Public Prosecution Service of Canada, which is independent of the Ministry of the Attorney General. Thank you.
Thank you. Final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, back to the Premier. Media reporting that Jerry Lougheed may also be charged with bribery alongside Pat Sabera, the CEO of the Ontario Liberal Party. During the investigation, it was revealed Mr. Lougheed told Mr. Olivier, quote, "I come to you on behalf of the Premier," end quote. Mr. Speaker, who ordered Jerry Lougheed and Pat Sabera to allegedly offer Andrew Olivier a bribe if the Premier did not simply say so? Not to answer is hiding information from the House. I want an answer, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you.